Good evening, everyone. This is the Frankish Librarian. Happy to be here with y'all on March 11th. It's not quite 7 o'clock yet, but I figured we might as well go ahead and start. All right. I don't think I have anybody in chat yet, but, well, hopefully that'll change. Oh, well. Don't want to start reading quite yet. But we are starting with The Birth of the Middle Ages by Henry St. Lawrence Beaufort Moss. Don't know much about him. I think he's an Anglican. He's an Englishman. First edition was 1935. Older book. It's decent as far as history is concerned. I prefer French authors, but you can still glean whatever you need from the English. They're not so bad at history. Typically, yeah, I try to find French authors translated into English, but we'll give old Moss a chance. But we're going to start tonight with the preface. Try to read through the preface. I don't know how far we'll get, especially because I chose a great day to do my first stream, because it is supposed to be pouring down rain, tornado watches, all that good stuff. So we'll see how long the internet holds out. And if the internet does go out, if it all crashes and burns on me, then we will probably come back Friday. Do a Friday stream. I've been thinking about doing Friday streams anyway, but we got to see if the Wednesday streams work out first. So we're going to take this one step at a time. But I think we might give it another minute or two. Let's see. All right. Yeah, we'll go ahead and start. Eventually, I want to get a starting soon screen or something, but we'll like I said, one step at a time. We'll figure it out. Not that a starting soon screen isn't exactly necessary, but you got to imitate other people at the start and then develop your own thing. That's what this is. That's all this is there's a guy I used to watch a good bit, and he would do something similar. He was more of an economics guy. I would watch him. He was great. So that's what kind of inspired me. But, all right. Preface. Again, The Birth of the Middle Ages by Henry St. Lawrence Beaufort Moss. Preface. Between the ancient and the medieval worlds, there lies a great gulf, bridged perhaps only so far as the general reader is concerned by the magnificent architecture of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. Oh, looks like internet's already dying. Wonderful. Yeah. All right, well, yeah, okay, we can start from the beginning. Is it glitchy or whatever? I know my internet isn't great right now. I think I dropped some frames a little bit. Well, all right, let's do it. Preface. Between the ancient and the medieval worlds, there lies a great gulf, bridged perhaps only so far as the general reader is concerned by the magnificent architecture of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. Despite the intensive researches of recent years, it would be idle to deny that the centuries known as the Dark Ages still remain one of the obscurest stages in European history. Yet progress is undoubtedly being made in the elucidation of many of the principal problems. Certain views have definitely been discarded. Audio drop. Is that better? Microphone's a little better? All right, cool. Where was I? Good old Dark Ages. By Dark Ages, he probably means, doesn't mean the Middle Ages. Probably means from actually so this book is 358 to 814. That's scholars who don't think that the Middle Ages are the Dark Age will typically contend that about this time period is the actual Dark Ages. Certain other French authors, like in Henri Pirenne. Well, no, this is kind of more of a me thing. I don't think the Dark Ages really happened at all. But that is something we can definitely get into a little later. Let's see. So, Dark Ages still remain one of the obscurest stages in European history, yet progress is undoubtedly being made in the elucidation of many of the principal problems. Certain views have definitely been discarded. The Roman Empire, it is now seen, did not end with the capture of the western capital or with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. The catastrophic explanation of the passing of the Roman world yields place on further analysis to a more reasoned theory of evolution. Justice is beginning to be done to the greatness of the Byzantine achievement and to the true character of the civilization which continued the Roman tradition on the shores of the Bosphorus. The Islamic onslaught is no longer viewed through the eyes of medieval opponents, for whom its menace to their religion obscured the common origin of Christian and Mohammedan culture. Sure. Critical study of the art and literature of this time has in many cases led to a more favorable estimate and has undoubtedly deepened the sense of continuity between the old order and the new. The great figures of the age stand out more vividly than before, and the findings of archaeology, together with the recent interest and economic conditions, have produced for the imagination a more lively picture of the everyday existence of communities and individuals. This part about archaeology is interesting. There's some guys I've been listening to a little bit who kind of delve a little bit into the archaeological side of the Roman history. But I was reading a little bit ahead earlier today, and there's a section I do want to that I'll come back to this archaeology aspect of. In the following pages, an attempt is made to present a brief outline of 4 centuries of European history, viewed in the light of these results. The arbitrary nature of historical periods, which are actually, in certain respects, little more than a superior form of memoria technica, is sufficiently obvious to need no emphasis. Organic processes cannot be cleanly bisected with a stroke of the pen, and it is hardly to be expected that all forms of human activity should develop pari passu. Various dates have in consequence been given for the beginning of the Middle Ages, ranging from the 3rd to the 8th century, and each has its justification, according to the importance attached to a particular aspect of European civilization. The year 395 has perhaps as good a claim as any to be regarded in this light, for the death of Theodosius the Great occurred at a moment of the most critical importance for Europe. For the last 3 years, Theodosius had ruled supreme over Roman territory. Henceforth, there is to be separation of East and West, final in fact, though not in theory. While he lived, Britain, Gaul, and Spain could be accounted integral parts of the Roman Empire. In less than a generation, all 3 were in the hands of barbarian conquerors, and Rome itself had fallen a prey to the Visigoths. The warrior emperor, 2 of whose immediate predecessors had fallen in battle on the frontier, is succeeded by a line of puppet rulers, and the effective control of the Roman state passes for well nigh a century into the hands of masters of the soldiers. Internally, less striking changes are observable. The barbarian inroads, though terrible enough, only accentuated the disorder and distress from which most of the western provinces had suffered ever since the anarchy of the 3rd century. The momentous reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, which ended this anarchy, were, to a large extent, only the fulfillment of tendencies already visible under the earlier empire. For the close of the 4th century produced no real break in the system of imperial government. They did but expressly recognize the fact that the household of Caesar had already superseded that constitutional executive which the empire had inherited from the Roman Republic. One change, however, of greater importance than any other for the future of Europe was introduced by Constantine, when the Christian Church was admitted to a share in the government of the state. Here lies the watershed between two worlds. For the adoption of the new faith altered the cast of men's minds and determined the policy of their rulers. Only under Theodosius does the Roman Empire finally cease to hold the balance between Christian and pagan, and thus only at this point do the full consequences of Constantine's revolutionary action begin to take effect. For this reason, if for no other, this survey may fitly take as its starting point the death of Theodosius the Great, the founder of the Christian state. It should perhaps be stated that the sketch maps and pictures included in this volume are intended to serve merely as elucidations of the text. I have also done some other research and found some very good maps of the Roman world at this point. All of the, some very good maps, very detailed. References to some historical atlases and illustrated histories of early medieval art will be found in the bibliography. I should like to express my gratitude to Professor N.H. Baines for constant help and encouragement in the writing of this book, to Mr. E.L. Woodward, Professor H.A.R. Gibb, Mr. R. Burley, and Mr. J.N.L. Myers for valuable criticism and suggestions, and to the officers of the Clarendon Press for their courtesy and forbearance. August 1935, Henry St. Lawrence Beaufort Moss. Great name. All right, so this book, 395 to 814, Theodosius the Great to the death of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the greatest. We love Charlemagne. I originally found this book because I was interested in, where is he? Charles Martel. Where are you at? Franks. Yeah. Charles Martel was originally how I found this book. So I was looking for something on him. And then I started reading it, and then the author was annoying. No, not quite. Not quite, Bennett. Close, but not quite. Anyway. Yeah, the author got annoying at some point, so I stopped reading it. But I figured it's a good one to start with because it's I know more now, and who knows, maybe we can pick them apart a little bit. Audio's still good? All right. All right, we can get into the first chapter. Part 1, Romans and Barbarians. Chapter 1, the Roman world. Thoughts of Imperial Rome. Wow. How, oh, OBS disconnected. Can y'all hear the rain? I imagine so. All right. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, but I don't think any of y'all were here. If the internet goes out, which it very likely will. Yeah, if the rain knocks out the stream, I'll probably just not try to come back and we'll restart on Friday probably. But we're gonna get as far in as we can go. Yeah, it is. Oh, wow. So many people. Too bad I know all of you. Anyway. All right. Chapter 1. The Roman World. Thoughts of imperial Rome conjure up to the mind's eye a picture of war and conquest, of legions marching under the victorious eagle to the subjugation of distant peoples. Yet the real fact which characterizes the first 2 centuries of the Christian era is the deep peace which descended upon the whole Mediterranean area and enveloped the greater part of Central and Western Europe. By the time of Augustus, the empire had expanded practically to its fullest extent. Footnote, with a few important exceptions, for example, Britain and the districts north of the Danube and east of the upper Euphrates. So, practically to its full extent, and the work of his successors was mainly a work of consolidation. Within the great fortified barriers of Rhine, Danube, and Euphrates, a network of roads covered the vast territories of Rome from the borders of Scotland to the Arabian deserts. Along these roads passed an ever-increasing traffic, not only of troops and officials, but of traders, merchandise, and even tourists. An interchange of goods between the various provinces rapidly developed, which soon reached a scale unprecedented in previous history, and not repeated until a few centuries ago. Metals mined in the uplands of Western Europe, hides, fleeces, and livestock from the pastoral districts of Britain, Spain, and the shores of the Black Sea, wine and oil from Provence and Aquitaine, timber, pitch, and wax from South Russia and northern Anatolia, dried fruits from Syria, marble from the Aegean coast, and most importantly of all, grain from the corn-growing districts of North Africa, Egypt, and the Danube Valley for the needs of the great cities. All these commodities, under the influence of a highly organized system of transport and marketing, moved freely from one corner of the empire to the other. Yet, most important of all, grain. The Punic Wars played a big part in Rome getting North Africa. That was the fight against Carthage, Hannibal, and all that. Because of that, Rome has North Africa. Also, it's their bread basket. All of their food came from North Africa, and that created a lot of complications later during the barbarian invasions, and more especially during the Islamic invasions. Because Italy wasn't great at producing its own food. It was able to sustain itself a bit, but Africa opened up a ton of food and produce and everything they need. They were able to get all of that from there. So they were able to, import it all in. It was very important to them, and they used a lot of resources to try to secure it, keep it secure, especially when it was under attack in the centuries following. The manufacture of articles for wholesale export received also a great stimulus, and flourishing industries developed in almost every province. Commerce and banking had been intensively carried on for centuries in the Hellenistic world, and the eastern end of the Mediterranean was the first to profit by the new order. Broadly speaking, these eastern provinces were the region of industry and manufacture. The west was the great storehouse of raw materials. Thus, from Damascus, Antioch, and Alexandria came blankets, tapestry, and rugs, linen, pottery of the finest sort, glass, both cheap and expensive, jewelry, perfumes, and cosmetics. So this pottery line is what makes me think of when he talks earlier in the preface about the archaeology. These guys I've been listening to, they've been reading through, or at least they did a while ago. They read through Henri Perrin's book, Muhammad and Charlemagne, which deals a lot with this era. And he delves deeply into trade, and he's a very economically minded historian. But they talked a good bit about pottery on their channel, and pottery and archaeology. So Rome had, according to them, Rome had its own manufacturing, specifically for pottery, and they made a ton of it. For them, it was easy to make. They could mass produce it, essentially. And so you're able to tell kind of how kind of what era. If you find a building that has a bunch of pottery in it, you can pretty much tell what era that building is from how much pottery and also the kind of pottery, because obviously pottery and all of these arts develop more. But they were saying that there are mounds outside of Rome that were basically garbage dumps, but specifically for pottery. And this pottery doesn't dissolve, it doesn't really disintegrate. So there's thousands and thousands of pieces of ancient pottery, and they were saying that these archaeologists who find it, they don't even try to keep it anymore. They don't put any new pottery in museums unless it's like something really special, because there are thousands of examples of this Roman pottery. So I thought that was interesting. Archaeology and history are very deeply tied, obviously. So during the first 2 centuries, however, a westward movement of industry can be observed. Fortunes were being made in the cornlands and ore-producing districts of Gaul, Spain, Italy, and Africa. And to satisfy the demands of a wealthy and luxurious class, Greeks, Egyptians, and Syrians crowded to the west to exercise their skills as doctors, artists, teachers, musicians, or silversmiths. The Syrians in particular were the supreme traders of this time. As single adventurers or in merchant communities, they are found all over Europe. In the cities of Africa and Spain, or thickly clustered along the trade routes of the Po Valley and the Rhineland. Even in the 5th century, Jerome bitterly observes them carrying on their gainful traffic amid the ruins of a fallen world. I don't know what Jerome he's talking about. I think he's talking about Saint Jerome, but I don't know. I don't think that lines up with the 5th century. I think Saint Jerome was 4th century. I might delve a little bit into who this Jerome is. Is that, I don't know why you would just mention Jerome as if everyone knows that, but I kind of understand. I will try to find out who Jerome is. The advance of industry is shown in more direct fashion by the appearance in the West of factories of considerable size, pottery and glass centers, for instance, in middle and southern France, in the Rhine Valley, or in Britain, where the mass-produced articles either killed or else drove into other channels the individual fancy of Celtic design. And like I had said, there were some of these in Rome itself. Nor was trade limited by the boundaries of the empire. The frontiers in this respect were not a dividing barrier, but rather a line of outpost settlements joining the termini of the Roman road systems, which furnished markets for the barbarians beyond. Horse trappings and jewelry, coins and pottery, household ornaments and agricultural implements, bartered against slaves, amber, or hides, passed from the Gallo-Roman workshops over the Rhine and far into central Germany, finding their way into the strongholds of chieftains in Denmark or South Sweden. Roman merchant vessels put in at Irish ports or roved southwards down the forested coastline of West Africa. The eastern traffic held even more romantic possibilities. The Red Sea connected with Alexandria by harbor, a canal, and a carefully policed caravan road, equipped with storage depots and water reservoirs, was the terminus of several great shipping routes. One led down past Abyssinia and Somaliland, as far as Uganda, south of which the Arab trader retained his monopoly. Ivory, tortoiseshell, and Negro slaves from the interior were collected in return for gaily colored cloths and glass, axes, brass, and copper ornaments. The southwest corner of Arabia exported incense and spices to the west, and handled, in addition, the products of India and China, such as cotton, silk, tea, ebony, and sandalwood, which were unloaded also at the Red Sea ports and the harbors at the head of the Persian Gulf, traveling thence by caravan and arriving finally at Alexandria, or at one of the great Syrian commercial centers, such as Damascus or Antioch. The use of the monsoons, however, had recently been discovered, and direct trade within India, eliminating the Arab middleman, was soon financed on a large scale by Alexandrian and Syrian merchants. At one Red Sea port, Strabo was informed that no less than 120 vessels a year sailed for India, and other sources tell of the colonies of foreign merchants settled in the coastal cities of Malabar, of the magnificent harbors of South India and Ceylon, with their lighthouse systems and pilot services, their spacious warehouses and wharves, and of the arrival of the Roman argosies, discharging their cargoes of singing boys and maidens destined for the harems of Indian princes, their silver vessels and bright linens, their Mediterranean wines, and their stores of imperial gold pieces, in payment for the huge sacks of pepper, the heavy cotton bales, the diamonds, pearls, barrels, drugs, and perfumes which they carried back to the Western world. Yeah, there's a map I had seen which showed all of the different locations where Roman gold has been found, and there's some in Russia, northern Russia, but there's some in Malaysia, Eastern Asia. Audio's out. Yeah, frames had dropped for a second. So is it back for y'all? Audio's back. Y'all hearing fine now, or audio still gone? Okay, yeah, what? Okay, I'm assuming you can hear me. No audio still? All right. Awesome. You gotta give me more than yeah. Okay, you're good. Cool. All right. So gradually the merchants sailed further eastwards. The Ganges estuary and the Malay Peninsula became known. In about AD 160, traders from the Roman Empire established connection with the Chinese ports. But the great days of Roman commerce were now over. Centuries of disorder were in prospect for Europe, and the possibilities of Chinese influence on our civilizations were never realized. Ease of communication and ready exchange of commodities did much to promote unity and even uniformity in the Roman Empire. Oh, I forgot to mention. So Malaysia, I might be wrong on this, but after Rome, after we stopped having relations with India because of the obvious Muslim invasions, Arabia and the Asia Minor and all that were closed. Because of all that, I think the first contact that the West has with Malaysia after the Muslim takeovers is in like the late 1500s, and it was the Portuguese. A guy by the name of Alfonso de Albuquerque. Eventually, I'd like to read a book about him. His story is awesome. But yeah, it's a long time passes before you get any contact with Malaysia and all that, and Eastern Europe, or Eastern Asia, sorry. Yeah. A common standard of life was shared by the majority of its inhabitants. Lamps, drinking vessels, heating arrangements, interior decoration differed but little in the villas of southern England and those of Algiers. The gold denarius commanded equal confidence in the Rhineland, the Crimea, or the Senegalese bazaars. Language became standardized, Latin prevailing in the west and Greek in the east. In many districts, the indigenous speech wholly disappeared. The common institutions under which they lived furnished another bond of union between the peoples of the empire from the government of the various provinces, though adaptable to local conditions, was essentially a single system directed from the center, a system, moreover, which tended towards increasing uniformity and the elimination of anomalies. Thus, in AD 212, all right, good. Audio is back for everyone, it sounds like. Thus, in AD 212, by a decree of Caracalla, the majority of the emperor's subjects became Roman citizens, and the inferior status of the provincial disappeared. The administration of Italy herself, though she long retained certain privileges as regards taxation, was eventually assimilated to that of the provinces, and her pride of place in the West, already challenged by Gaul, Africa, and Spain in the fields of literature and commerce, suffered still more from this humiliation. These are but two instances of a far-reaching development. As the dangers to the empire increased, so her statesmen redoubled their efforts to preserve the tottering edifice by rendering it a homogeneous structure, homogeneous structure, different from homogeneous, I think. Clamping it together with the iron logic of legal codes and tyrannical enactments, careless of over-rigidity or suppression of living stress and counter-stress, and concerned only to produce the stability of a solid and undifferentiated block of matter. Vulnerable points in the imperial system were discovered, not created, by the strains and perils of its later centuries. Yeah, well, thank you, Fred Malbec. Vulnerable points in the imperial system were discovered, not created, by the strains and perils of its later centuries. Modern analogies to the social and economic conditions of the ancient world are often misleading, for they tend to obscure the more primitive aspects of its civilization. Judged by present-day standards, the population of Europe at this time was extremely small. That of the Roman Empire has been estimated at not more than a quarter of the numbers now inhabiting the countries in question. Its distribution was extraordinarily unequal, the eastern half being preponderant not only in the density of its inhabitants, but in its level of wealth and culture. No town in the west, with the exception of Rome and Carthage, could compare with the splendid cities, many of them with a population of over 100,000, which flourished in Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. The last named province, despite its small size, furnished something approaching 1/7 of the whole numbers of the empire, and the greater part of the revenues was supplied by the countries bordering on the eastern Mediterranean. On the other hand, the total population of the Roman Empire, after 3 centuries of existence, had become definitely smaller. Italy and Greece, in particular, had suffered, and large tracts of Gaul lay desolate owing to the ravages of plague and civil war. The cultural influence of Rome was exercised unevenly upon the West. Roman roads like the modern bypass or arterial way left untouched, the Roman roads like the modern bypass or arterial way left untouched large districts in the interstices. All right, the left untouched large districts in the interstices of their network, where the language and customs of the natives were barely affected by those of their conquerors. Especially was this so in the regions of the north and west, where tribes of shepherds and primitive agriculturists, thinly scattered amid marsh and forest, did not repay fiscal and commercial exploitation as did the intensively cultivated Mediterranean area. Further, the Roman influence was diluted in proportion as it approached the confines of the empire. The frontiers themselves were becoming blurred. German princes beyond the Rhine absorbed Roman culture. Masses of barbarians were allowed to settle upon Roman territory in eastern Gaul and the regions south of the Danube. There were even Roman citizens under the later empire who preferred to dwell at the court of some foreign ruler rather than face the increasing demands of the imperial tax collector. Yes, that is correct, Bennett. That's at least what I've heard as well. The Romans knew how to build. Yeah, I've heard that too, I think. Volcanic ash. They got it all from Pompeii. Maybe. Even in the East, where for 3 centuries before Rome's arrival, The Hellenistic kingdoms, which grew out of the conquest of Alexander, had been spreading the ideals of Greek city life. National traditions only lay dormant, waiting for the hour of liberation to strike. The Greeks formed only a tiny minority in Syria and Egypt, where their superiority in culture, not in numbers, had given them the advantage. This is where Cleopatra comes from. The Egyptian pharaohs, I'm not sure when, but at a certain point they were all Greek. Cleopatra was Greek. It's probably why Caesar didn't like her. Older civilizations in these lands, though temporarily submerged, retain their vitality, and the growth of Coptic and Syriac literatures, stimulated by the rise of Christian churches, which became a mouthpiece for separatist and local sentiment, fostered a consciousness of alienation from their foreign conquerors, and intensified the bitter opposition to imperial policy and taxation. The final loss of these provinces was due in great part to such internal causes. Persian and Muslim invaders of the 7th century found support in many disaffected quarters of these regions. In Asia Minor, only the seaboard fringes were truly Hellenized, but the mountainous interior, haunt of brigands and principal recruiting ground for the later Roman army, possessed no cultural traditions which could serve as a focus of discontent, and Byzantium in consequence retained her grasp upon the whole peninsula until far into medieval times. The successive shocks which the civilized area of Europe had received since the close of the 1st century revealed the insecurity of the imperial structure. The reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180, witnessed the turning of the tide of Roman prosperity, and the end of the Antonine House was followed by a century of disorder, in which the central power wavered, passing rapidly from one short-lived emperor to another, made and unmade by their capricious or covetous legions. Military absolutism appeared, effacing the last vestiges of the fictitious diarchy of Augustus. The influence of the armies increased as the need for them became greater. The frontiers were threatened unceasingly. Germanic tribes from the Low Countries to the Danube mouth pressed against the restraining barriers, and Saxon pirates in the Channel had their counterparts in the Gothic sea raiders of the Black Sea and northern Aegean coasts. A fresh peril arose in the east when the Parthian rulers of Persia were replaced by the aggressive Sassanid house. 227. The Euphrates line now demanded constant reinforcements, and the Roman Empire, with its insufficient troops, was henceforth condemned to struggle with the problem of a double front. After a lapse of nearly 6 centuries, Persia renewed her attempts, crushed by the victorious advance of Alexander the Great to regain the sovereignty of Western Asia. The great king of the days of Marathon appeared once more, claiming equality of status with the other world ruler at Rome. More than once during the 3rd century, the Persian horsemen swept through Syria almost to the Aegean, threatening the commerce of one of the richest provinces. A climax was reached in the disastrous campaign of 260, when Valerian, a Roman emperor, was taken prisoner by the Persian monarch. It is probable that Rome's prestige in the Near East never recovered from this blow. The Sassanid triumph, assiduously placarded in rock sculpture and fresco, must have spread like wildfire through the cities of that great caravan world, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, whose strange mixture of cosmopolitan luxury and desert squalor, commercial interests, brigandage, and fiery fanaticism shaped a few centuries later the career of Muhammad and the progress of Islam. The mighty power of Rome, which had paved with stone blocks the desert routes, garrisoned the oasis fortresses, and extended its sphere of influence ever farther along the traffic lines of camel-borne merchandise from India and the Far East, was now fighting on equal terms with the Iranian forces, and maintaining with increased difficulty its traditional frontier. I don't know why he refers to them as Iranian here, but Persian everywhere else. Not important, but significant of Rome's weakness was the sudden rise of the short-lived empire of Palmyra. based on the caravan trade, which maintained a brief but glorious independence until its queen Zenobia was overthrown by Aurelian. A similar phenomenon was taking place in the west, where the Gallic provinces, which had revolted from the central power, offered a successful resistance for over 10 years. Even Italy herself was in danger of barbarian invasion. Aurelian's great walls, which still encircle Rome, indicate, like those of other Italian towns rebuilt at this time, the coming transformation of the open cities of the ancient world into the moated and turreted strongholds of the Middle Ages. So this harkens back to what he was saying about how 395 is what he considers the beginning of the Middle Ages in some ways. And you see this a lot. You see the influence even as far back as, this is, I think, 300s or so. The walled towns, specifically walled cities like this, you start seeing more of, and you start seeing more ideas pervade that eventually turn into what we know as the Middle Ages. A big part of that, which I think he gets into later, is the monastic life. The monastic life is huge for the development of Europe. Especially it started like especially the 400s, 500s, 600s. You really start a massive surgence of monastic life, specifically from Ireland. Thank you, St. Patrick and Augustine of Canterbury. Yeah, the Irish are the ones who built a monastic life in France, Frankish Empire, and consequently most of the rest of the world. St. Benedict kind of perfected it, as the Italians tend to do. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. I believe we will get there eventually. The economic crisis of the empire reached its height during these years, and the need for precious metal to provide donatives for the legions, or donatives for the legions on whose purchase loyalty the power of the emperor depended, coincided with a disastrous shortage of gold and silver ore, and a precipitous fall in the revenues obtained from taxation. The balance of trade during the first 2 centuries AD had probably been in favor of the exporting countries of Asia, and indications exist, though exact assessment is not possible, of an eastward drain of specie from the Roman Empire. More serious, perhaps, was the falling off in the production of the European mines. A marked deterioration of the currency is noticeable at this time. Gold vanished from circulation, and the silver of earlier days became little more than thinly washed copper coin. This was silver. I know Fred Malbec is going to love this. Silver became the mainstay, the main coinage during the Frankish times. A lot of silver mines were started then. Gold vanished from circulation and never really made much of a resurgence. I think maybe at some point during the Middle Ages it did. But even up until Charlemagne's time, it was copper a little bit, and then mostly silver. You see a lot in the Frankish Empire, and once that split up from Charlemagne's children, it's all silver. It's all silver coinage. Despite the debasement, prices retained a certain stability apart from a considerable rise due to the decreased bullion value of the denarius until the reign of Gallienus, 253 to 268. A period of extreme inflation now set in. Under Aurelian, the price of wheat in Egypt soared to dizzy heights, followed at some distance by the rate of wages. Banks closed and were commanded to reopen. Speculation in currency was rife. Trade with the East, which had been based on a gold coinage of full weight and purity, was seriously affected and showed no real revival until the days of Justinian, though the Mediterranean traffic still continued with much of its former intensity. One of the first tasks in Diocletian's great reorganization of the empire was the restoration of a gold and silver coinage, which was carried out more successfully than his subsequent attempts to control by edict the market price of foodstuffs. How far he can be said to have checked the transition from the money economy of the early empire to the natural economy of the Middle Ages is a question probably impossible to answer. Drop in frames again. Let me give it a second. All right, I think we're good. The Army and Civil Service, got silver on the mind. The Army and Civil Service, both meagerly paid, had always maintained themselves largely from other sources. The provision of quarters and rations, transport, and other services was exacted by the soldiers, and fees douceurs, traveling facilities, and free lodging by the officials. Okay, yeah. To what extent these were estimated in currency values, it is difficult to determine, but the system remained in force under Diocletian and Constantine. In the financial machinery which they created was in essence merely a legalization of such semi-regular practices. It is no derogation of the magnificent services of these two men, whose work saved the empire from imminent dissolution, to hold that their reorganization was in fact a realist acceptance of the actual situation rather than the creation of a new model of government. Yeah, gold, you kind of think would. Because we always consider gold to be obviously the more valuable, because it is. But a lot of the gold came from outside the Roman Empire. A lot of it came from Asia Minor, Africa. And so at a certain point, you stop getting trade from these areas and you stop having gold, an influx of gold. If there's no trade, there's no money going back and forth. And so for coinage inside the kingdoms, it was easier to switch to a silver because they could mine the silver in the Frankish Empire specifically. I'm thinking of, they could mine the silver there. They couldn't mine the gold. They didn't have gold mines really. And so silver just became the typical currency. Copper, the guys I had mentioned earlier who talked about archaeology also talked a little bit about coinage, because the book they were reading, that guy really delves into the economic side of it, the towns and how trade worked with them. And he talks about copper coinage a little bit. And they were specifically talking about copper coinage really not being a big thing later on. Once silver starts to really pick up value, and once that becomes the main currency, copper phases out because things were kind of more expensive. That was kind of the solution they drew. I'm not sure how much I believe that. I don't know too much about it. But with a lack of trade, things became more expensive. And so it was just easier to use silver, I guess. That was kind of the conclusion they came to. Again, I don't know how true that is. But it's interesting to think about. All right, so changes in the army had already been made by former rulers. The sharp distinction of the frontier troops, which had steadily deteriorated into a militia of settled farmers, from the field army of picked fighting men, is only a recognition of the needs of the time. A mobile striking force, capable of being thrown at a short notice into any outlying province, would at least serve to expel barbarian raiders, whose entry the frontier garrisons had been unable to prevent. The weakness of the central power is acknowledged by the decentralization of provincial government, smaller units being created in the interests of efficiency, while the position of the emperor himself, degraded of late by dependence on legionary caprice, is raised high above all sectional interests by the accentuation of his semi-divine status, already foreshadowed by former emperors, and its expression in elaborate court ceremonial, influenced perhaps by Persian example. Even the foundation of Constantinople, which marks indeed the beginning of a new era, may in another aspect be regarded simply as a full confession of the fact that the city of Rome was no longer the center of the empire. One startling innovation, however, was destined to alter the whole basis of the Roman state: the transformation of Christianity by Constantine's action from the position of a proscribed religion to that of the honored faith of the imperial house. 3 centuries of development in dogma, administration, and geographical extension lay behind it by this time. It numbered several millions of adherents, far the greater part of whom belonged to the eastern provinces, though the activities noted above of Greeks and Syrians in Western Europe had carried the new teaching into the commercial centers of these regions. The first primitive communities had long been replaced by the beginnings of an ecclesiastical hierarchy, for which the civil machinery of Roman provincial government provided the model, while the political and economic importance of the metropolitan cities determined, to some extent, the authority enjoyed by the bishops of Rome, Carthage, Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria. Christianity had begun among the lowliest classes of society. I think these are some of the main. I know these 5 are kind of the patriarch seats, at least some of them. I don't actually remember how many patriarchs there are. I don't know if it was 12 or if it was just 5. Yeah, these were all the patriarchs. Christianity had begun among the lowliest classes of society, and its membership was still largely confined to the uneducated, though Christians were to be found in every rank of life and even in court circles. 3 centuries of contact, however, with the world of the early Roman Empire had profoundly modified the terms in which it expressed itself, and the 4th century, with its altered conditions, accelerated the results of such interaction. Inadequate though it must be, some account must nevertheless be given of the atmosphere which prevailed at the time of Theodosius the Great. During these centuries, the character of paganism had been completely transformed. Genuine allegiance to the old city-state deities of Greece and Rome had long ceased among the thinking members of society, but their thrones did not remain unoccupied. Skepticism, though prominent in literature, was steadily giving place to a different conception of religion, based on the desire for personal communion with the divine. In many shapes and combinations, the mystery cults of Thrace, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Persia were adopted by the Roman world, and Hellenic myths, if not discarded, were woven in stylized forms into the pattern texture of these composite faiths. What I think he's kind of talking about here is the Roman tradition, I guess you could say, the Roman tradition of when they conquer. Actually, I think he talks about it in a second. When they conquer in an area, they wouldn't force them to worship the Roman gods. They would just incorporate that people's gods into their pantheon. I think that's kind of what he's talking about here. Political conditions favor the fusion of localized worships into a larger whole. Yeah, so that's what he's talking about. Even at the far-off beginnings of the city-state in mainland Greece, many a village god had faded into an adjective of Zeus or Athena. A similar process can be seen at Rome, though the unifying tendency here was offset by her readiness to receive foreign deities into her crowded pantheon. The rise of the Hellenistic monarchies, which ended the vivid community life of the city-state, turned the minds of men inwards, each one seeking a path to individual salvation, while the absolutism of the new kingdoms, modeled on Asiatic example, accustomed the Greek-speaking world to the idea of ruler worship, which, as a powerful instrument of state, was carefully fostered by the reigning dynasties. Rome reaped the results of this when she introduced her imperial cult and the Stoic doctrine of an all-seeing, beneficent providence. Rome reaped the results of this when she introduced her imperial cult, and the Stoic doctrine of an all-seeing, beneficent providence may well have assisted the humble provincial in his conception of the omnipotent emperor, whose justice determined the lives and welfare of vast populations. The development of philosophic thought was no longer antagonistic to popular beliefs, but aided powerfully the henotheistic currents of religious feeling. All right, Old myths were let's see. The development of philosophic thoughts was no longer antagonistic to popular beliefs, but aided powerfully. Dipped there for a second. I guess the rain is having some slight effect. All right. The development of philosophic thought was no longer antagonistic to popular beliefs, but aided powerfully the henotheistic currents of religious feeling. Old myths were first rationalized, then symbolized, and the common features of various cults recognized as approaches. I'm sorry. Old myths were first rationalized, then symbolized, and the common features of various cults, recognized as approaches to a single divine power, were mingled eventually into a nebulous mass, out of which the noble mind of Plotinus, applying the canons of Hellenic reasoning to matter unsusceptible of such treatment, strove to create an ordered system. Neoplatonism, however, in his hands was less a doctrine than a way of life. A contemplative attitude had replaced the practical Stoic outlook, with its emphasis on conduct, and although the rationalizing element in Plotinus, the Greek presupposition of an intelligible universe whose phases are logical consequences one of another, must not be overlooked. The essence of his thought is a mystical, almost sensual apprehension of reality, an immediate awareness without the interposition of the reasoning faculty. This is made possible by the internal affinities existing among all persons and objects in the universe, which lie hidden under the surface of appearance and phenomena, such as telepathy, omens, and astrological combinations, can readily be explained by the same theory. Thaumaturgy, ritual purification, and divination, however, form only a small part of the system of Plotinus. It remained for his successors in their attempt to gather together all the forces of paganism against the common enemy, to enlist such magical aids to capture the emotions of the multitude, while to close the ranks of the intellectuals, a blending of almost every doctrine of the ancient world, from Plato and Aristotle to the Stoics and Cynics, was ingeniously accomplished. The mystic cosmology of Neoplatonism and its scheme of redemption, as developed by Iamblichus, was thus the final shape assumed by organized paganism in its struggle with Christianity. And the contest must be viewed not as a battle between faith and skepticism, but as a rivalry between two competing mystery religions, both speaking the language of their time. Let's look at this footnote. This applies principally to the East, where the term Hellenism, applied by Christians to their opponents, reveals the conscious, though unsuccessful, attempt to muster the traditions of classical culture in defense of the old religion. Paganism, its Latin counterpart in the West, points to the sporadic survival of primitive village rites. Only at Rome, with her historical memories, a political and aristocratic cult of the old deities still held its own. That's all right. Dogma apart, there is hardly an aspect which is not found equally in pagan and Christian. Asceticism, fasts, vigils, Puritanism, rituals, saints, angels, demons, and the reliance on visions and sorts. Pagan and Christian art use the same symbolism and are often indistinguishable, save where exclusively Christian motives are employed. Modern criticism, moreover, has tended to lessen the number of these. Christians, by the 4th century, had accepted and absorbed the pagan learning, and the issues of the great councils turn on Platonic and Aristotelian concepts, which conditioned men's thinking in this age, much as the evolutionary and psychological standpoints govern it today. Yay. It is significant that Julian, in his efforts to restore pagan worship, aimed at establishing a kind of church, similar in many respects to the Christian organization. A fixed dogma, a regular hierarchy, a system of hospitals, almhouses, and poor relief were established, and even, for the clergy, an index expurgatorius. This this is a interesting idea to me. It's it's kind of a blanket statement, but I think Chesterton wouldn't necessarily disagree. There are a lot of similarities. Obviously, the Roman Catholics were Roman, so they developed that. They were part of that culture, and as Christians do, they try to perfect it. But the idea of the pagans having saints is kind of, yeah. Chesterton talks about this when he talks about pagans in The Everlasting Man. He talks about how at a certain point the Romans, they just kind of developed gods for everything. They had gods of the hearth, the god of sitting at the table. They had gods for pretty much everything. And even if the Christians didn't directly think this is the parallel we're going to make, it developed in a similar way. And so our saints are obviously, we have patron saints of just about anything. And it's kind of a Christianizing of that idea of the spiritual. They saw kind of the pagans they needed something mystical. They needed something spiritual. And so they were able to take what was good and Christian and apply that mysticism to it, because mysticism is incredibly important and very, very overlooked, especially nowadays. That's a good point. War heroes like Horace. And the war heroes, you've told me this before. Like war heroes, sometimes ended up basically becoming their gods. It's I've heard, yeah, Saints of the Civic Order. Yeah, I've heard that Zeus was probably an ancient Greek chieftain or ruler. Yeah, that's a good point too. The war heroes, people from their actual history who they revere. Not necessarily like ancestor worship, but kind of in some way, I guess. Let's see. The strength of the Christian position was convincingly shown by Julian's failure to accomplish his purpose in face of public opinion. Rationalized myths and synthetic deities lacked the popular appeal of the gospel stories, so much closer in time and spirit to the world of the 4th century. The esoteric subtleties of Neoplatonism and the fluid, accommodating character of pagan syncretism were equally deficient in compelling power. In its exclusive monotheism, Christianity shared with Judaism, in contrast with other ancient religions, an immense source of stability. There was no place in it for other deities, save in the guise of malevolent demons. A hard core of doctrine was steadily forming, reinforced by the possession of an authoritative scripture. Here, too, a need of the times was met, for an increased reliance on authority is characteristic of the later stages of Greco-Roman thought. The original inventive genius of Greece had long since disappeared, and the Roman triumphs in literature, art, architecture, engineering, and even law were, in the main, the result of a brilliant application of principles already discovered. Footnote. Bury's trenchant verdict, the Romans of the empire originated nothing. It is not too much to say that from Augustus to Augustulus, poverty of ideas, incapacity for hard thinking, and excessive deference to authority characterized the Roman world. Am I reading that right? Okay, yeah. Yeah, now I get what he's saying there. Basically, taking taking what they had found before and applying the principles, which is, you see throughout history, that's what Islam did when they conquered Persia. Everyone always is everyone always talks about, uh, modern historians like to talk about how Islam invented algebra. Ooh, it was the Persians. The Persians invented algebra. The Muslims did do a good job of preserving a lot of that stuff. I think I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they are the reason we have certain of the older Greek philosophies. I think they preserved some of that stuff, but nothing they have is original. Men were aware that the golden age lay behind them. Nostalgia for the past and consciousness of present inferiority are themes familiar in the writings of this period. The Emperor Constantius, visiting Rome for the first time towards the end of his career, reserved his highest admiration for the Forum of Trajan, but he considered it far beyond mortal resources to rival so great a work, and declared himself competent only to imitate the horse of Trajan's equestrian statue. Maybe 1 second. I'm going to look for it's a long section. The 4th century is, above all, an age dominated by the unseen. Mysterious threads linked every object in the universe in bands of sympathy or antipathy. Sun and moon exercised their influence on the creatures belonging to their kingdoms. Cockcrow at morning, flowers turning into sunshine had their mystical significance. Footnote. Memories of much of this late paganism can be divined in the magical practices of the Middle Ages. Sure. I wonder how much this magical practices he's thinking of is just kind of the mysticism of the saints or the monastic orders. I don't know. So it's always hard for me to tell what, especially these non-Catholic authors are talking about when they talk about magical practices and how much just kind of what they're talking about. If they think that they're all of these people were performing like blood magic or whatever. I don't know. Be interesting to look into. Man himself, born under an astral combination, accompanied through life by a guardian spirit, was placed in a world where even inanimate substances possessed magical qualities, and the least action or incident might prove ominous or disastrous. Never was the divine voice heard more frequently or more plainly. Visions and their interpretation became ever more prominent, and the world of dreams steadily encroached upon men's waking hours. A strongly subjective tinge colors the thought of this time. The internal conflict and emotional experience of the individual take on a heightened value, beside which the outer world fades into unreality. Even the great work of Augustine, whose influence on the Middle Ages can hardly be overestimated, is characterized by this dreamlike quality. The sharpened points of his magnificent, though often contradictory rhetoric furnished a whole armory of weapons for medieval controversialists of varied and even opposite schools, and the claims of papacy and empire in a Western Europe which Augustine never imagined were debated in terms of his dialectic. Yeah. I don't know about this whole contradictory thing from Augustine. Often contradictory. I don't know. I don't know enough about Augustine. But it's interesting that Protestants love talking about Augustine for some reason. He seems to be, if I hear a Protestant talking about an early church father, normally they talk about St. Augustine. I guess they can misinterpret his stuff best. But this I'm also not sure of. I'm not sure what he's trying to say here. I do kind of know what he's trying to say. Western Europe, which Augusta never imagined, were debated in terms of his dialectic. Mm. I know what I'm thinking, but I can't. I'm having a hard time putting it into words. I guess we'll just move on. But Augustine of the 4th century must be distinguished from the superstructure reared on his foundations by the systematizing energy of subsequent centuries. Augustine stands in the midst of the ancient world, bounded by the limits of the Roman Empire, and still in possession of the full resources of Western culture. He stands at the same time apart from this world, enclosed in his dream of a heavenly city, whose denizens are but strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Both these aspects, the unity of pagan and Christian civilization on the one hand, and the deep cleft between them on the other, were equally alien to the Middle Ages. When its former subjection to the Roman emperors had become no more than a memory in the west of Europe, and the full stream of classical learning had dwindled to a few runlets, carefully guided into ecclesiastical channels. Viewed from the standpoint of his age, the Civitas Dei of Augustine is less a philosophy of history than a passionate assertion of divine intervention in human affairs, less a prophetical formulation of the future limits of church and state than the ecstatic vision of a philosopher mystic, transcending the mournful realities of his time in the description of an ideal society, founded on the principle of true justice, whose gaze is fixed not on the world of sense, but on the battlements of an eternal city not made with hands. I think we're going to stop here for today. You know, it being the first stream, I'm not used to it all. My voice is kind of wanting to go out. So, page 14. But it's yeah, it's sometimes a little hard to get through. I remember reading through this the first time and just kind of blanking when he was talking about his ideas of mysticism and this philosophy. I guess it's good setup. Helps you understand what all is going on. But it's not my area of expertise. Once we get into the more historical side of it, I guess I can. Augustine is perfect, yes. Once we get into the more historical side, then I'll have some actual decent commentary I can add. But before we do anything, I want to pull up my maps. So here we have our Byzantine Empire, our Roman Empire in 330. This would be about the time of Constantine, I think. I really like this map. It's very very clear. But just to kind of give you an idea, so this is, you got Rome here. This is our Rome. Jerusalem, Alexandria is here. The mouth of the Nile. This is your breadbasket. This whole area right here, especially here. Carthage is right here. This is where the vast majority of Roman grain, Roman wood, this is where everything in Rome comes from. Now, a conversation I had a while ago, it had been brought up, where are the Roman shipyards? And I wanted to look into that, so I did a little bit There was a Roman shipyard here in Portus. There was one, let's see. Ravenna. Where's Ravenna? I've always wondered where Ravenna is. Ravenna. There was a big shipyard here in Ravenna. See, it was Portus, Ravenna, and then there was another place not far from Rome that built a lot of ships. But I'm pretty sure there were also some in Carthage. Carthage was known to have a massive fleet, especially during the Punic Wars. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to harass Rome as much as they were able to. Here's, you get Hippo Regius. This is where I think Augustine was. Hippo Zartarus. But the extent of the Roman Empire. You got Scotland, and it all the way down here. You have the Cyan Berenice. It goes far into the west, Mosul almost. Yeah, okay, Constantinople's here, so this would have had to have been during Constantine's reign. Ooh, the island of Rhodes. Very important island throughout history. The Knights, not the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers were set up on the island of Rhodes. And after 1453, I think was the year Constantinople was conquered. I think it might have been a little before that. The Knights of Rhodes, the Knights Hospitallers were kicked out of Rhodes, and they ended up in Malta. Which Malta is probably not listed on here. I think this is Malta. I think we have Malta here. That's when they became the Knights of Malta. Was once they settled there. They settled in Malta. But yes, this is... So the Punic Wars are actually, obviously, some of the most important wars of ancient history. Before the Punic Wars, before the first Punic War with Carthage, this was Rome. Let's see if there's a way to hide. Is there a way to draw? No. Hold on. All right. I'll look into drawing on here later. But this was about all that was there for Rome. After the Second Punic War, in which Hannibal crosses from here and goes up, crosses the Alps, which obviously one of the most impressive feats of military genius in history. He almost takes Rome, but thanks to the Carthaginian bureaucrats, they never take it. They come very close. At this point, Rome is basically dead. It's basically just the city. All of their armies have just been annihilated, and they can't really do anything. They can't push Hannibal out. He's on their doorstep, but he gets called back. He gets called back to Carthage because the Carthaginians are like, oh, Rome's already taken. We don't need to finish the job. So they call him back. And Rome takes advantage of not having to fight against that genius, and they build their armies back. And they push all the way over here. They take large swaths of Spain, and then they take all of North Africa, and then they sack Carthage. Hannibal's killed outside the walls, and a treaty is made with Carthage. They get all of this. At this point, they control all of Spain, large swaths, and all of North Africa, and they start getting tributes from North Africa. They start, getting bread, wheat, grain, wood, everything. 100 years later is when you have Scipio. Scipio is angry at Carthage, obviously, because some history with Carthage. They kind of create a false pretense, and they invade Carthage, and they burn it to the ground, and they completely destroy Carthage. They sow salt into the earth, so nothing can grow in that area anymore. There's not I think there's only a few stones left in the area where Old Carthage is, which this is probably not where Old Carthage was. It's probably, I think, up here, maybe. It might have been here, but I don't think it was. It might have been somewhere else. No, it's not Tripoli. But Carthage is just completely annihilated, and that sets Rome up for success because by that point, that's I think 140 BC. They control just most everything, and then obviously Julius Caesar brings all of this consolidates all of this. He brings all of this in. I'm not entirely sure when the Middle East is brought into the fold, but yeah, I really like this map, mainly because it's one of the only maps I can find that has decent you can actually see when you zoom in. See, but okay, so here is the Danube River. He brings that up. The Danube and the Rhine are connected. Or no, they're not. No, the Rhine ends here. The Danube comes all the way over here. Let's see, and here is the good old Euphrates River. Yeah, just to give a little context. We have our Aegean Sea. Black Sea. Not called that yet, but sometimes you just gotta look at a map. Londinium. Nice to know the name hasn't really changed. See, I don't think Aachen isn't a thing yet. But Aachen will be very important later. And I will ramble on for hours about Aachen. At least what happens at Aachen. Nile River. Only river in one of the only rivers, or the largest river in the world that flows north. Can't see the river, the lake it starts from, but it flows north. But I think that is a good starting point. A good let's see, we've been going for almost an hour and a half. So yeah, I think we're good to go. Thank y'all for stopping by for chatting. Smash that like button and subscribe button. It'd make my day. And yeah, and all that. But I appreciate y'all coming. If y'all have any questions, I will y'all know where to find me. Follow me on Twitter. My Twitter is linked in the bio. Eventually, I would like to do a Telegram chat, but I might have some secondary research I post on the Twitter and the Telegram chat if I once I get it. But thank y'all for coming. Y'all have a good night.